Welcome back to Space for Sonda. And if you're new here, welcome. My name is Kira, and today I'll be your host. Today's episode explores the relationship between mental health and the ways we connect with other people. Not just in romantic partnerships, but across friendships, family dynamics, and the everyday relationships that shape how we experience ourselves and the world around us. This distinction is important because mental health does not operate differently depending on the label we assign to a relationship. It moves through all interpersonal spaces, influencing how we communicate, how we interpret behavior, how we regulate emotion, and how we experience closeness and distance. Despite this, relationships are often framed within cultural narratives as spaces of ease and stability. There is a widely held assumption that when a relationship is right, it should feel natural, intuitive, and relatively uncomplicated. Difficulty, particularly emotional difficulty, is frequently interpreted as a sign that something is wrong, either with the relationship itself or with the person within it. However, this assumption is not supported by psychological research. The work of John Gottman, based on decades of longitudinal studies, demonstrates that conflict, miscommunication, and emotional disconnection are not indicators of relational failure, but inherent aspects of relational life. What distinguishes stable and satisfying relationships is not the absence of these challenges, but the presence of effective repair processes and emotional attunement. When mental health is introduced into this already complex dynamic, the expectation of ease becomes increasingly unrealistic. Mental health is not fixed. It is shaped by biological, psychological, and social factors, and it fluctuates across time and context. These fluctuations inevitably influence how individuals think, feel, and relate to others. Anxiety can heighten sensitivity to perceived threat. Depression can reduce emotional availability, and both can alter patterns of communication and connection. As a result, relationships are not static environments, but evolving systems influenced by the internal states of those within them. Before moving further into this discussion, it is important to acknowledge that this episode includes themes surrounding mental health, including anxiety, depression, emotional distress, and relational strain. While these topics are explored in a reflective and academic manner, they may resonate on a personal level. You are encouraged to engage with this at your own pace, to pause where necessary, and to prioritize your well-being throughout. If anything raised here feels difficult, reaching out to someone you trust or seeking professional support can be an important step. What this episode aims to do is not provide simplified solutions or universal answers. Instead, it seeks to develop a deeper understanding of how mental health operates within relationships, how it shapes perception, influences behavior, and contributes to the complexities of human connection. By grounding this discussion in psychological theory and research, the aim is to move beyond surface-level interpretations and toward a more nuanced, compassionate understanding of both ourselves and others. Mental health is most commonly understood as an individual experience. Within dominant biomedical frameworks, it is located within the person, defined by symptoms, diagnoses, and internal processes. While this model is essential for clinical understanding and treatment, it does not fully account for the ways in which mental health is expressed, shaped, and sustained within interpersonal contexts. Increasingly, psychological research highlights the importance of relational frameworks, which position mental health not only as something internal, but as something that is co-regulated, co-experienced, and negotiated through interaction with others. This perspective is grounded in the foundational work of John Bowlby, whose attachment theory proposes that emotional regulation develops through early relationships with caregivers. According to Bowlby, individuals from internal working models based on these early interactions, cognitive and emotional frameworks that shape expectations of self and others. These models influence how individuals seek support, respond to closeness, and interpret relational experiences throughout their lives. Building on this, Mary Ainsworth identified distinct attachment patterns, including secure, anxious, and avoidant styles, which continue to influence behavior across a range of relational contexts, not limited to romantic partnerships. Importantly, these attachment patterns are not confined to early development. They persist into adulthood and manifest across relationships, friendships, family relationships, and social interactions more broadly. For example, individuals with an anxious attachment orientation may demonstrate heightened sensitivity to perceived rejection, often seeking reassurance and struggling with ambiguity in communication. In contrast, individuals with avoidant attachment tendencies may prioritize independence and respond to emotional distress through withdrawal or disengagement. When mental health difficulties such as anxiety or depression are present, these patterns are often intensified. Anxiety, for instance, is associated with increased threat perception, particularly in social contexts, leading to hypervigilance and overinterpretation of relational cues. Depression, on the other hand, is linked to reduced emotional responsiveness, lower energy, and withdrawal from interaction, which can impact relational engagement. These experiences are not purely internal. They are expressed through behavior and therefore become part of the relational dynamic. This is where misunderstanding frequently occurs. Behaviors that are rooted in psychological distress are often interpreted at surface level, without consideration of the underlying processes. Reassurance seeking may be perceived as excessive or needy, while withdrawal may be interpreted as disinterest or lack of care. However, when understood through a psychological framework, these behaviors can be recognized as adaptive responses to internal states rather than intentional relational actions. This shift in interpretation is significant, as it moves the focus away from blame and towards understanding. Another important concept within relational approaches to mental health is emotional contagion. Research by Hatfield suggests that individuals in close relationships unconsciously mirror and internalize each other's emotional states. This process is facilitated through nonverbal communication, behavioral synchrony, and neurobiological mechanisms that enable emotional resonance. As a result, mental health is not only experienced individually, but can also influence the emotional climate of a relationship. For example, prolonged exposure to anxiety may increase tension or stress in others, while ongoing withdrawal associated with depression may contribute to feelings of distance or uncertainty within the relationship. This does not suggest that individuals are responsible for each other's mental health. Rather, it highlights the interconnected nature of emotional experience within relational systems. Relationships can therefore be understood as emotional environments in which individual psychological states interact and influence one another. This perspective challenges the notion that mental health should be managed entirely independently of relational life and instead emphasizes the importance of context in understanding behavior. Understanding mental health as a relational phenomenon has important implications. It allows for a more nuanced interpretation of behavior, recognizing that actions within relationships are often shaped by underlying psychological processes rather than deliberate intent. It also highlights the importance of awareness, both of one's own internal experiences and of the ways in which they may be expressed and interpreted by others. Without this awareness, patterns of misunderstanding can develop, reinforcing relational strain. Ultimately, this perspective encourages a shift in how relationships are understood. Rather than viewing difficulty as evidence of incompatibility or failure, it can be recognized as a reflection of the complex interplay between individual psychology and relational dynamics. This does not remove the challenges that mental health can introduce into relationships, but it does provide a framework for approaching those challenges with greater clarity and compassion. As we move forward, this understanding will form the foundation for exploring more specific aspects of mental health and relationships, including attachment, communication, boundaries, and emotional responsibility. To develop a deeper understanding of mental health within relationships, it is necessary to move beyond present interactions and consider the role of relational history. Human beings do not enter relationships as blank states. Rather, they carry with them a set of expectations, emotional responses, and behavioral tendencies that have been shaped over time. These patterns are often formed early in life and continue to influence how individuals experience connection, conflict, and emotional security in adulthood. The theoretical foundation for this lies in attachment theory. Originally developed by John Bowlby, Bowlby proposed that early relationships with caregivers form the basis for what he described as internal working models, deeply embedded beliefs about the self, others, and the nature of relationships. These models influence how individuals interpret relational experiences, particularly in moments of vulnerability or distress. Building on this, Mary Ainsworth identified patterns of attachment behaviour, demonstrating that individuals develop consistent ways of responding to closeness, separation, and emotional need. These early frameworks do not remain fixed in childhood, they are carried into later relationships, often operating outside of conscious awareness. As a result, individuals may find themselves responding to present situations in ways that are shaped by past experiences, even when those experiences are no longer relevant to their current context. This is particularly significant when mental health difficulties are present, as heightened emotional states can activate these underlying patterns more intensely. For example, an individual who has experienced inconsistency or unpredictability in early relationships may develop an anxious attachment style, characterized by a heightened sensitivity to relational cues. In adulthood, this may manifest as a tendency to overanalyze communication, seek reassurance, or experience distress in response to perceived distance. Importantly, these responses are not indicative of weakness or excess. They are adaptive strategies that developed in response to earlier environments. However, within current relationships, they may create tension if they are not understood in context. Conversely, individuals who have learned to rely on themselves due to emotional unavailability in early relationships may develop avoidant tendencies. These individuals may struggle with emotional expression, find closeness overwhelming, or withdraw during periods of stress. Again, these behaviors are not inherently problematic, but they can create challenges within relationships where emotional openness is expected or required. When mental health difficulties such as anxiety or depression are introduced, these attachment-based responses can become amplified. Anxiety can intensify fears of abandonment or rejection, while depression can increase withdrawal and reduce emotional responsiveness. This creates a dynamic in which relational patterns are not only repeated, but reinforced. This process can be understood through the concept of repetition compulsion. Originally introduced within psychoanalytic theory and later explored in broader psychological research, repetition compulsion refers to the tendency to recreate familiar relational dynamics, even when they are unhelpful or distressing. This does not occur because individuals consciously choose these patterns, but because familiarity provides a sense of predictability, even if that predictability is uncomfortable. Within relationships, this may manifest as repeatedly seeking reassurance from others, consistently withdrawing during conflict, or engaging in cycles of approach and avoidance. Over time, these patterns can become self-reinforcing. For example, reassurance seeking may lead to temporary relief, but may also increase dependence on external validation, thereby maintaining underlying anxiety. Similarly, withdrawal may reduce immediate discomfort, but can also create distance, reinforcing feelings of isolation. Research in relational psychology suggests that these patterns are not easily disrupted without awareness. Individuals often recognize the outcomes of their behavior, such as conflict, distance, or misunderstanding, without fully understanding the underlying processes that contribute to them. This can lead to frustration, self-criticism, and a sense of being stuck within relational dynamics. Understanding the role of attachment and relational history therefore provides an important framework for interpreting behavior. Rather than viewing patterns as fixed traits or personal failings, they can be understood as learned responses that developed within specific contexts. This perspective allows for greater self-compassion, whilst also creating the possibility for change. It's also important to recognize that these patterns do not exist in isolation. Within any relationship, both individuals bring their own histories, attachment styles, and psychological experiences. The interaction between these factors can create complex dynamics. For instance, an anxious individual may seek closeness during distress, while an avoidant individual may respond by withdrawing, leading to a cycle in which both individuals feel misunderstood. This dynamic has been widely explored in attachment research and is often referred to as the anxious avoidant trap, highlighting the way in which differing relational needs can interact in ways that reinforce distress for both parties. Ultimately, recognizing the influence of relational history does not mean that individuals are defined by their past. Rather, it provides a framework for understanding how past experiences continue to shape present behavior. This understanding is essential for navigating relationships in a way that is both informed and intentional. If mental health shapes internal experience, and attachment shapes relational patterns, then communication is the space in which these processes become visible. However, communication within relationships is often misunderstood as a straightforward exchange of information. In reality, it is a complex process involving interpretation, emotion, and meaning making. What is said, what is heard, and what is understood are not always the same, particularly when mental health is involved. Within psychological frameworks, communication is closely linked to perception. The work of Aaron Beck highlights how cognitive processes influence the way individuals interpret their environment. According to cognitive theory, individuals do not respond directly to events, but their interpretation of those events. These interpretations are shaped by underlying beliefs, past experiences, and emotional states. In the context of relationships, this means that communication is rarely neutral. A simple message, a change in tone, or a delayed response can carry different meanings depending on the individual interpreting it. For someone experiencing anxiety, ambiguity may be interpreted as threat. A delayed reply may be perceived as rejection, or a brief response as disinterest. These interpretations are not consciously chosen, they arise automatically, shaped by underlying cognitive patterns. This is particularly relevant when considering cognitive distortions, patterns of thinking that are biased or exaggerated in ways that reinforce distress. Common distortions include catastrophizing, where individuals assume the worst possible outcome, mind reading, where individuals believe they know what others are thinking without evidence, and personalization, where neutral events are interpreted as personally significant. These distortions have been widely documented within cognitive behavioral research and are strongly associated with anxiety and depression. Within relationships, these patterns can significantly impact communication. An individual may respond not to what has actually been said, but to what they believe it implies. This can lead to misunderstandings, conflict, and emotional escalation. Importantly, these reactions are often experienced as valid and justified, even when they are based on inaccurate interpretations. At the same time, mental health can influence not only how communication is interpreted, but how it is expressed. Anxiety may lead to heightened communication, such as repeated messages or reassurance seeking. Depression may result in reduced communication, including delayed responses or withdrawal from interaction. These differences in communication style can create further misunderstanding, particularly if they are not recognized as expressions of internal states. This highlights the importance of what is sometimes referred to as meta-communication, communication about communication. Rather than focusing solely on the content of interactions, meta-communication involves explaining the meaning behind behavior. For example, an individual might clarify that their need for reassurance is linked to anxiety, or that their withdrawal is related to low mood, rather than a lack of interest. Research on relational satisfaction suggests that perceived understanding and responsiveness are key factors in maintaining connection. However, effective communication is not solely about expression, it also involves interpretation. Listening within relationships requires more than hearing words. It involves recognizing the emotional context in which those words are being spoken. This is particularly important when mental health is involved, as individuals may struggle to articulate their experiences clearly. Emotional states such as anxiety or depression can reduce clarity, increase defensiveness, or limit the ability to express complex feelings. As a result, communication within relationships often involves a degree of uncertainty. Misunderstandings are not only possible, but likely. The key factor is not the absence of misunderstanding, but the ability to recognize and repair it. Research by John Gottman emphasizes the importance of repair attempts, small efforts to reconnect and de-escalate tension during conflict. These attempts can take many forms, from clarification to reassurance, and are a strong predictor of relational stability. Ultimately, communication within relationships affected by mental health requires a shift in perspective. It involves recognizing that behavior is not always a direct reflection of intention, and that meaning is often constructed rather than inherent. By approaching communication with curiosity rather than assumption, individuals can begin to move beyond surface-level interpretations and towards a deeper understanding of one another. This does not eliminate difficulty, but it does create the conditions for more effective and compassionate interaction. As we move from understanding patterns in communication into the lived experience of relationships, it becomes necessary to understand the concept of boundaries, not as barriers to connection, but as conditions that make connection sustainable. Within everyday discourse, boundaries are often misunderstood as something rigid or distracting. They are sometimes framed as a withdrawal of care, or as a way of limiting emotional closeness. However, psychological research suggests the opposite. Boundaries are not the absence of connection, but the structure that allows it to exist without becoming overwhelming or depleting. Supporting someone experiencing anxiety, depression, or emotional distress often requires a level of ongoing emotional engagement. This engagement can include listening, reassurance, presence, and responsiveness, all of which are valuable and meaningful forms of relational care. However, over time, this sustained engagement can also become emotionally demanding. The concept of emotional labour, introduced by Arlie Hochschild, provides a useful framework for understanding this dynamic. Emotional labour refers to the process of managing one's own emotional responses in order to meet the needs of others. While originally applied to professional contexts, it has since been widely used to understand interpersonal relationships, particularly those involving caregiving or support. Within relationships affected by mental health difficulties, emotional labour may involve regulating one's own reactions in moments of heightened distress, offering repeated reassurance, or maintaining a sense of stability when the other person is struggling. While these behaviours are often grounded in empathy and care, they are not without cost. Research by Charles Figley highlights the concept of compassion fatigue, a state of emotional exhaustion that can occur when individuals are exposed to ongoing distress without sufficient recovery or support. Although this concept is frequently discussed in caregiving professions, it is equally relevant within personal relationships. When emotional labour is continuous and unbalanced, individuals may begin to feel overwhelmed, depleted, or disconnected from their own needs. This introduces a tension that is often difficult to navigate. On one hand, there is a desire to support and be present for others. On the other, there is a need to preserve one's own emotional well-being. Without boundaries, this tension can lead to burnout, resentment, or withdrawal, outcomes that ultimately undermine the relationship itself. Boundaries in this context are not about reducing care, but about defining what is sustainable. They involve recognizing personal limits, communicating those limits clearly, and allowing space for both individuals within the relationship to exist as separate emotional beings. From a psychological perspective, this aligns with the principles of differentiation, a concept central to family systems theory, particularly in the work of Murray Bowen. Differentiation refers to the ability to maintain a sense of self while remaining emotionally connected to others. Individuals with higher levels of differentiation are able to engage in relationships without becoming overwhelmed by the emotional states of those around them. In contrast, low differentiation can lead to emotional enmeshment, where boundaries between individuals become blurred. In such cases, one person's distress may be experienced as overwhelming by the other, leading to either over-involvement or emotional withdrawal. Both responses can disrupt relational balance. And within relationships affected by mental health difficulties, this balance becomes particularly important. Without boundaries, there is a risk that one individual becomes positioned as the supporter, while the other becomes defined by their distress. Over time, this can lead to role fixation, reducing flexibility within the relationship and limiting the capacity for mutual support. Research on relational satisfaction consistently emphasizes the importance of reciprocity, the ability for both individuals to give and receive care. When one person consistently occupies a caregiving role without space for their own needs, this reciprocity is disrupted. This does not negate the importance of support, but it does highlight the need for balance. Importantly, boundaries are not only relevant for the supporting individual, they are equally important for the person experiencing mental health difficulties. Setting boundaries around communication, energy, and emotional capacity can help individuals maintain a sense of agency, rather than becoming defined solely by their struggles. This can reduce feelings of guilt, dependency, or self-stigma, which are commonly associated with mental health challenges. Understanding boundaries as relational tools rather than restrictions allows for a more sustainable model of connection. It recognizes that care is not measured by how much one can endure, but by how effectively individuals can support each other without losing themselves in the process. If boundaries define the structure of relationships, then empathy defines their depth. Empathy is often positioned as a central component of healthy relationships, and for good reason. It enables individuals to recognize, understand, and respond to the emotional experiences of others. Within relationships affected by mental health difficulties, empathy can play a crucial role in reducing misunderstanding, fostering connection, and creating a sense of safety. However, empathy is more complex than it is often presented. It is not simply the act of feeling what someone else feels, but a multidimensional process involving both emotional and cognitive components. Emotional empathy refers to the ability to share in another person's feelings, while cognitive empathy involves understanding those feelings from a more reflective, perspective-taking standpoint. The distinction between these forms of empathy has been explored in the work of Simon Baron-Cohen, who highlights the importance of balancing emotional resonance with cognitive understanding. While emotional empathy can create closeness, excessive emotional involvement without regulation can lead to distress or overwhelm. Cognitive empathy, in contrast, allows individuals to understand another's experience without becoming consumed by it. When someone is experiencing intense emotional distress, those around them may attempt to fully feel that experience as a way of demonstrating care. While well-intentioned, this can lead to emotional overload, reducing the capacity to respond effectively. In contrast, a balance of emotional and cognitive empathy allows for both connection and stability. At the same time, empathy has limits. It is not always possible to fully understand another person's internal experience, particularly when that experience involves complex mental health conditions. This can create frustration on both sides of the relationship. The individual experiencing distress may feel misunderstood or invalidated, while the other person may feel inadequate or unsure of how to respond. Research on relational intimacy suggests that what matters is not perfect understanding, but perceived responsiveness, the sense that one's emotions are acknowledged, taken seriously, and met with care. This means that empathy does not require complete comprehension, but rather a willingness to engage, listen, and respond with sensitivity. Another important consideration is the role of validation. Validation involves recognizing and affirming another person's emotional experience without necessarily agreeing with their interpretation. This distinction is particularly relevant in the context of cognitive distortions. For example, an individual experiencing anxiety may interpret a situation as threatening, even when there is no objective evidence to support that perception. Validation in this context does not involve reinforcing the belief, but acknowledging the emotional reality of the experience. This approach aligns with principles found in therapeutic models such as dialectical behavior therapy, developed by Marsha Linehan, which emphasizes the importance of balancing acceptance and change. Within relationships, this means creating space for individuals to feel understood while also supporting movement towards more adaptive ways of thinking and relating. Intimacy in this context is not simply closeness, but the ability to share emotional experiences in a way that feels safe and reciprocal. Mental health can complicate this process. Anxiety may lead to over-disclosure or a need for constant reassurance, while depression may result in withdrawal or difficulty articulating emotions. These differences can create imbalances in emotional exchange, affecting the sense of connection within the relationship. However, when empathy is approached with awareness, recognizing both its importance and its limits, it can support a more sustainable form of intimacy, one that is based not on perfect understanding, but on consistent effort, openness, and care. Ultimately, Empathy within relationships affected by mental health is not about fixing or fully comprehending another person's experience. It's about being present within that experience, while maintaining enough distance to respond in a way that is both supportive and sustainable. As we reach the final part of this discussion, it becomes important to address one of the most complex and, at times, uncomfortable aspects of mental health and relationships: responsibility. Throughout this episode, we have explored how mental health shapes perception, behaviour, communication, and relational dynamics. We have considered the influence of attachment, the role of emotional labour, the importance of boundaries, and the function of empathy. What emerges from this is not a simple model of relationships, but a deeply interconnected system in which both individuals are continuously influencing and responding to one another. Within this system, the question of responsibility is not straightforward. A common tension within relationships affected by mental health is the distinction between understanding and accountability. On one hand, recognizing that behaviors may be shaped by anxiety, depression, or past experiences allows for greater compassion and contextual awareness. On the other hand, there remains a need for individuals to take responsibility for how their behavior impacts others. This distinction is critical. Understanding the origins of a behavior does not remove its impact. For example, anxiety may explain patterns of reassurance seeking, and depression may explain withdrawal or reduced communication. However, these behaviors can still affect others within the relationship, contributing to misunderstanding, emotional strain, or imbalance. A relationally informed perspective therefore requires holding both of these realities at once, that behavior can be both understandable and impactful. This aligns with psychological approaches that emphasize both acceptance and change, particularly within therapeutic frameworks such as dialectical behavioral therapy. DBT highlights the importance of validating emotional experiences whilst also encouraging individuals to take responsibility for their actions and develop more adaptive ways of responding. Within relationships, this translates into a shared responsibility model. Each individual is responsible for their own mental health, in the sense that they are responsible for seeking support, developing self-awareness, and working towards regulation where possible. At the same time, relationships involve a level of mutual care, meaning that individuals also have a role in supporting one another in ways that are compassionate and sustainable. However, this balance can become blurred. One of the most common challenges in relationships affected by mental health is the expectation, whether explicit or implicit, that one person should take on the role of managing or fixing the other's distress. While support is an essential component of relationships, research consistently demonstrates that relying solely on interpersonal support without external resources can place significant strain on both individuals. This is particularly relevant in the context of co-rumination, a process in which individuals repeatedly discuss and dwell on problems without moving towards resolution. While this can initially create a sense of closeness, studies suggest that it may reinforce anxiety and depression over time. This highlights the importance of distinguishing between supportive communication and patterns that may inadvertently maintain distress. Recognizing the limits of what relationships can provide is therefore an essential part of relational responsibility. Relationships can offer support, understanding, and connection, but they are not substitutes for professional care. Expecting a partner, friend, or family member to meet all emotional needs can create pressure that is difficult to sustain and may ultimately undermine the relationship itself. At the same time, individuals experiencing mental health difficulties may struggle with feelings of guilt, self-stigma, or the belief that they are a burden to others. The work of Patrick Corrigan highlights how internalized stigma can reduce self-esteem and discourage help-seeking behaviors. Within relationships, this can lead to withdrawal, reduced communication, or reluctance to express needs, all of which can further complicate relational dynamics. This creates a paradox. One person may feel like too much, while the other feels not enough. Without open communication and mutual understanding, both individuals may be navigating these experiences in isolation, despite being in close proximity. Growth within this context is not about eliminating mental health difficulties or achieving perfect relational functioning. It is about developing awareness of oneself, of others, and of the patterns that emerge within relationships. It involves recognizing when support is needed beyond the relationship, when boundaries need to be strengthened, and when communication needs to be clarified. It also involves a willingness to tolerate discomfort, because change within relationships often requires stepping outside of familiar patterns. For an anxiously attached individual, this may involve tolerating uncertainty without immediate reassurance. For an avoidant individual, it may involve engaging with emotional vulnerability rather than withdrawing. These shifts are not easy, but they are central to relational development. Ultimately, mental health within relationships is not a problem to be solved, but a dynamic to be navigated. And navigation requires both compassion and accountability. What this episode has aimed to do is move beyond simplified narratives of relationships as either healthy or unhealthy, easy or difficult. Instead, it has positioned relationships as complex, evolving systems shaped by psychological processes, emotional experiences, and interpersonal dynamics. We have explored how mental health influences the way individuals perceive, communicate, and relate to one another. We have considered how attachment patterns shape expectations, how cognitive processes influence interpretation, and how emotional labor and boundaries affect relational balance. Across all of this, one theme remains consistent. Relationships are not separate from mental health. They are one of the primary spaces in which it is experienced. This understanding invites a shift in perspective. Rather than asking whether relationships should be affected by mental health, we begin to ask how they are affected, and what that means for the way we engage with one another. It encourages us to move away from blame and towards context, away from assumption and towards curiosity, away from perfection and towards awareness. Because at the center of all relationships are individuals who are navigating their own internal worlds, often in ways that are not immediately visible to others. And perhaps the most important takeaway is this: understanding does not remove difficulty, but it changes how we respond to it. If anything discussed in this episode has resonated with you, or if you're currently navigating challenges related to mental health in your relationships, support is available. If you're based in the UK, you can reach out to Samaritans, who offer free, confidential emotional support 24 hours a day. You can call them on 116 123 or visit their website for more options. For urgent mental health support, NHS 111 can provide immediate guidance, and in emergencies, contacting emergency services is always the safest option. If you are outside of the UK, similar services are available internationally, and seeking local support can be an important step. It is also worth remembering that support doesn't always have to be formal. Talking to a trusted friend, a family member, or someone who feels safe can make a significant difference. You are not expected to navigate this alone. Take care of yourself. Take this at your own pace. And I'll see you soon. Thank you for joining me in Space for Sonder.